All right, so good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining in person and online. This is another installment of the Core Seminar Series, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome Chris Labos, Dr. Chris Labos here. Um, so he will be talking to us about how to communicate science effectively. He's a McGill-trained cardiologist. He's affiliated with the Department of Biostats and Occupational Health in the School of Population and Global Health. He has appeared in various media, both print, online, radio. Um, he's even published a book, Does Coffee Cause Cancer?
Yeah.
A story about food epi.
You have to
Uh,
stay.
and I'm just going to read out this last part to make sure I don't screw it up. But so he realizes that half of his research findings will be disproved in 5 years. He just doesn't know which half. And occasionally he finds time to practice as a cardiologist so he can buy groceries. To date, no one has offered him his own primetime TV show, but I'm sure that's a matter of time.
Yeah,
So
there we go.
take it.
Thank you so much, Ben. All right. Hello, everyone. Hello to all of you who are here. Hello to all of you who are online. We are here to talk about effective science communication. And I always kind of struggle when people ask me to talk about this because I'm always a little bit uncertain about how much people want to know and how much people really care about this, because to some degree you can go your whole careers just doing your research and getting published and not really engaging in science communication because it's not always fun. So before we get into the main talk, this is my disclosure slide. I don't have any disclosures. So this is a painting of Hippocrates refusing a gift from Artaxerxes III. And that's because I don't take money from private industry. I think it's important when you do science communication that you don't take money from private sources, because you need to be able to maintain that objectivity, and you need to be able to tell people like, no, I don't take money from big pharma, and because that's an important counterpoint to a lot of the criticisms and accusations that are going to get thrown at you, whether it's justified or not. So I tell people I don't take money from the pharmaceutical companies. I also don't get paid for most of the media appearances, by the way. Whenever I tell people this, they look at me and they're like, you are a moron. They're like, how much are they paying you for CTV? Like, you do that every week. I'm like, nothing. And they're like, what? Are you nuts? The time that you spent. And yeah, it is time. It is. And I conceive of it as a public service. That's why I do it. So, and I realize that some people have a very, very negative impression of how the media works. Okay. And you could be forgiven if you thought that this was how journalists make health headlines, right? You spin three wheels and you find out that coffee can cause depression in twins. And then the next day you spin the wheels again and you find out that red wine can cause glaucoma in rats. And you would be forgiven for thinking this because, quite frankly, everything has been shown at some point to both cause and prevent cancer. This is a graphic that appeared in Vox, but it was based on a paper several years back where each of these red dots is one study. And you can, quite frankly, if you cast a wide enough net in the scientific literature, you can find papers showing that everything from wine to eggs to tea to coffee has been shown to both cause and prevent cancer at some point. And so if you put all this out into the general public, people are going to get confused, because if you were reading Time magazine, you would on the same day be subjected to a tweet that says that coffee can help you live longer and that it's been declared a carcinogen by the World Health Organization. You could read major American newspapers and find that fish oils are both good and bad for your heart. You can find that depending on what day of the week you're reading the Telegraph in the UK, you should either eat a high carb, low fat or a high fat, low carb diet. And so it's not surprising that people are confused. It's not surprising if you're confused, right? Because we are not just medical professionals and scientific researchers. We are also members of the public. We consume this information, and you can't be an expert on everything. So you're sitting at home, you're watching this stuff, and you probably yourself are saying, I'm not quite sure where all of this is going. This seems like it's a little bit all over the place. And so this is what I do. I try to fact check the internet. And as you can imagine, that is a bit of a difficult job. Fortunately, I have a very good assistant that helps me in my research. Toby is a very, very good boy, and he helps with Snuggles. But it's problematic because for all the goodwill that exists, there are a lot of really, really bad actors out there. Okay. There are bad people out there that, for lack of a better expression, really just want the world to burn. And if you do science communication, you are going to get death threats. I get death threats all the time. Now, you have to be, now listen, there's a few things that you can do to try to minimize that. If you're going to be a public facing science person, try not to be a woman or a visible minority. That definitely helps. But there's a lot of vitriol out there. And so you have to mentally prepare yourself for what you're going to get. And I don't judge people who don't want to deal with it because it is very toxic and it is very exhausting to have to deal with this, especially, during the worst days of COVID, when frankly, a lot of people just lost their minds. A lot of people panicked. And when people panic, I mean, it's basically the subplot of the third or fourth Harry Potter movie, right? Fear makes, was it fear makes wise people smart? No, fear makes wise people dumb and smart people. Anyway, something like that. The point is that when people panic, it brings out some of their worst tendencies, and some people do rise to the occasion. And the problem that we have as hopefully good science purveyors of good scientific information is that the celebrities have declared themselves to be experts. And so a lot of what we do is really about countering the misinformation that comes out of the mouths of celebrities. Now, I don't know how many of you know who Aaron Rodgers is or the stuff that he said about COVID and the vaccines, but he actually did a lot of damage because when people like him say stuff, we have to push back on it. And so the reason why I do what I do unpaid is that whenever Aaron Rodgers does something silly that isn't sports related, I can be there to set the record straight. Now, does it have the same impact? It's hard to know. Doing TV and media to a certain degree is kind of like screaming into the void because you don't have that immediate feedback. It's actually pretty rare for me to have an audience like this, outside of like teaching class, because normally I'm giving these, we're doing these capsules, we're recording, it's often live, and then I go off and I do my day. And so I don't always get the feedback. I've started to get more of it now because we're doing a lot more community events, which we're obviously not doing during COVID. But now, you go out to libraries, you go out to community groups, and you realize something. People want good scientific information. We keep talking about how there's misinformation, there's distrust in science. I don't actually believe that that's true. I'm going to show you a slide about that later. I don't actually believe that it's true. When we talk about, declining vaccination rates and we're talking about the rise of the anti-vaccine movement, I think there is definitely some of that. But I think there's a lot of people out there that really just want good information and they don't know where to turn. I just got an email this morning of this, this former patient. Actually, I don't really follow her anymore because she was fine. But she emailed me and she said, Dr. Labos, I have a question. I don't know what to do. Like, do I need a measles booster? I keep hearing about measles. And so I look, and she sends me like her information because people do that. And I'm like, well, because you were born prior to 1970, the general assumption is that if you were born prior to 1970, you were probably exposed to measles. And as a consequence, you probably have lifelong immunity. Now, you can always check if you had waning immunity. I had waning immunity because I'm of a certain vintage, and I grew up in a time when we only gave kids one measles vaccine, right? It was only in 1993 or 1996 that we started giving the two-dose vaccinations. So because I'm in that nice little gray zone, I never got measles because there was enough vaccination around at the time that measles had, more or less gone away. But I did not have the long-lasting immunity. So when I started medical school, I went to occupational health and safety, as you were supposed to do. I got my titers checked. I found out that I had zero measles antibodies left in my blood, got my second dose, and Bob's your uncle, now I'm fine. None of that is very hard, right? We just have to explain it to people. And so I emailed her back and I said, no, no, you don't have to worry. You're, of a certain age. You probably got measles. You're probably fine. If there's ever any doubt, you can always ask your family doctor to just check. It's a simple blood titer, right? It's nothing complicated. It's one of the check boxes on the form. You can actually check. It's there. So she was like, oh, thank you. That's very helpful. And that's what people want. They want good information. They just don't know where to get it. And unless we are there, unless we are participating in the public conversation, all people are going to see is the misinformation from celebrities and the garbage out there. There are good resources, right? Up to date, Medscape, whatever. I contribute to Medscape. I do constant stuff. The problem with the internet is that the good stuff isn't free and the free stuff isn't good. So we have to, as a public service, contribute to the free access to information that should exist on the internet by right. So let me explain to you my journey for what that's worth, and of one, but it'll give you hopefully an understanding as to how the media works and how you too can become involved. I get a lot of students that come up to me, they have the enthusiasm that you can only muster in your early 20s when they're like, I want to help, I want to do stuff, and I love it. I wish I had the funds and I wish I could give them a job, right? But I don't have the funds, I don't have the infrastructure to do this sort of thing. But I can at least show them how they can to some degree replicate what I did. And so I'm going to tell you how it happened. There is no, it's sort of like, it's like anybody, everybody here see the movie Kung Fu Panda, right? At the end, yeah. What's the secret ingredient in the noodles? No. Oh, you guys are disappointing me. It's a great movie. You should watch it again. What's the secret ingredient? The first one, the good one, the good one, the good one, the first one. What's the secret ingredient? There is no secret ingredient. There is no secret ingredient. There is nothing special about me. My mother has actually been wrong all this time. There is nothing special about what I do. I just do it ad infinitum in a tireless and relentless and stubborn unwillingness to stop. And so if you're willing to do the same, you can accomplish it. And that's frankly what we need. We need an unwillingness to stop because the battle against misinformation is never won or lost. It just has to be continuously prosecuted on a daily basis because with every fall of a bad idea, a new one will come up. Nobody is really talking about the fact that vaccines cause autism now, even in the darkest corners of the internet. It's not really something that people talk about. So that has sort of fallen off the conversation, but they still talk about anti-vaccine stuff. So we have to keep playing whack-a-mole to a certain degree about all of the new concerns that they have. And I'll show you some examples of that as we go. So I started writing for the Montreal Gazette in 2013, which was painful for me to write down on this slide because I didn't realize how long ago it was. And it started when I was actually doing my master's in epi here at McGill. And I was sitting in the back row with my friend Mark. And we were being taught a lecture on absolute risk reduction versus relative risk reduction, something like that. And I saw an article in the newspaper, also in the Gazette, about strawberries. And it was a research study that came out of the Framingham Heart Study. For people who don't know what the Framingham Heart Study is, it's this long running study. It was the study from which we got the term risk factor. That's where it came from. So Framingham is a small town in Massachusetts. Researchers went there, enrolled everybody in the town to sort of follow them over time. It's a large cohort study to look at risk factors for heart disease. And they've been at it for 3 generations now. So it's still ongoing, one of the largest research projects that have been done, frankly, one of the most important research projects, at least in the field of cardiology. But it keeps churning out data because when you have data, somebody's got to analyze it, and so they keep producing papers. And they produced one paper about strawberries and berries. And what they found were, and part of their questioning and part of their periodic surveys that they sent out to the participants, they found that women who ate strawberries or other berries more than 2 times per week or something like that had a reduced rate of heart disease. And that was the paper. And so, as you can imagine, a lot of the headlines were like, a tasty way to prevent heart disease, a very, very good way to help your heart, like stuff like that, right? It was naturally easy to write headlines. And, we have to have some forgiveness for the journalists because I have a whole talk about how the journalism is structured. But the problem is this: a lot of the journalists who are being assigned these stories, they are not health journalists. There are no health journalists anymore. There's maybe one in Canada. There's Andre Picard. There was Carly Weeks. She has since left journalism. We don't have specialists in the field of journalism anymore. Most of these people are general assignment reporters. So they are assigned the story and they are told, here's the press release, go. And more often than not, they have 4 hours, 5 hours to turn around the story. So they are going to do what they can. I mean, I think we have to have a recognition for how difficult it is to produce journalism in a 24-hour news cycle. So journalists did this because it was an easy story to write. They had a press release, they have a study. They're like, oh, heart disease, berries, good. Women, yeah, fine. Clip art, done. And so I wrote an article and I was like, actually, what happened was a friend of mine, his parents were journalists. And I said, how do I get involved? Because I really wanted to get involved in science communication. I just wanted to do that before it was cool. And so I asked my friend, how do you do that? And his parents were both journalists. He said, just write a letter to the editor. And I was like, really? You can do that? You can just write a letter to the Montreal Gazette? And they were like, yeah, you just write a letter. So I write the letter. I say, dear editor, blah, 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 absolute risk reduction, relative risk reduction. If you look at the other way, you basically have to take like 48,000 women and force feed them strawberries every day for 2 years to prevent one non-fatal heart attack. And when you look at it that way, it's not a very effective tool for long-term cardiovascular protection, right? And they were like, oh, Dr. Labos, thank you for this article. It was really great. If you could like cut out 2,000 words, we'll try to publish it in the newspaper. So I did. And, they published it and I was so excited. I went out, I bought 4 copies of the newspaper, clipped it out. I still have the original clipping. It's in a scrapbook at home. I stopped at a certain point, but I was very excited. And I said, can I send you more articles? And they were like, yeah, I'm not going to pay you. Go nuts. So that's what I started doing. And so it started sort of ad hoc. I would write stuff whenever it happened. And then it was like whenever they tried to fit it in. And then it's now a bi-weekly column. So I alternate with, oh my God, the political guy, former head of the NDP, he teaches at McGill. Tom Mulcair, thank you. Oh my goodness, that was a weird, yeah, Tom Mulcair, yeah. So I sort of alternate with him on Wednesday. So that's where my column is. So that's how that happened. And then when I wrote that first article, actually, shortly thereafter, that's when I started doing radio. So what will usually happen is the radio producers, there are various producers of the various shows, right? So CJD, to give you a thing, they have the morning show with Andrew Carter, right? Then they have Elias Makos, who's doing the 9 to 12. Then from 12 to 2 is the news show now with Vashi Kapelos. And then the afternoon is with Aaron Rand, and that takes them up to the news. So each of these shows has their own producers. And so the producers are always looking for stuff. And so I started doing ad hoc segments every time I would write an article because they bring me on. And so the first person who had me on was Tommy Schnurmacher, who some of you may remember, longtime legend in Montreal journalism. And so he invited me on. And this was back in the day when we'd still go in to do like live things in studio. And he said, you're during the commercial break, because we used to do 30-minute segments then. He goes, you're actually really good at this. You should come back. And I was like, I'll do it. Fine. I had all the enthusiasm of youth of an early 20-year-old. So I started doing these things ad hoc, and then they turned into a regular segment that I was doing with Ken for most of the pandemic every Sunday morning. And now that he's retired, I do it with Joanne Brackus. And we do the regular segments, but then they also know that they can call me when stuff happens. When there's a measles outbreak, there was a measles case at the Bell Center, and then they're like, what do we do? Because you get these statements from public health, but they're like, I need somebody to interpret it. And so more often than not, your role is not to really provide expertise because they don't need expertise. They don't need you to talk about the latest in measles virology. They want you to explain stuff to the general public. And so I am there on call, unpaid. And the producers know they can just call me or text me when they need something. And sometimes the turnaround time can be 15, 20 minutes. Like, are you free in 15 minutes? And the answer is always yes, because I understand how the media works. And so the radio then turned into CTV. I haven't been on CTV for a couple of months because when we had the big rainfalls in the summer, it destroyed their studio. They actually had to move to Nuns Island for a bit, and it's been a while, and I've been meaning to email them back to find out when we're going to start up again. It's apparently going to happen any day now. But the CTV stuff, again, was an ad hoc thing. I would do it with Mitz like every couple of weeks, months, whenever. And then at some point, she's like, oh, this is good. Maybe we should do it once a month. And then when COVID happened, she was like every week and sometimes multiple times a week, depending on what was going on. And again, I say like, it's kind of like screaming into the void because I don't really talk to people. The other day, somebody came up to me and they said, Dr. Labos, hi, I just wanted to say thank you. And I was like, oh, okay. For what? Are you patient? Like sometimes I don't remember. And she was like, no, I was so scared to get the COVID vaccines. But when I get a little emotional when I say this because she was actually very appreciative. She was like, because of you, I wasn't scared anymore. And I was like, oh. So you can have an impact because a lot of times people don't know who to turn to. And in an era where a lot of people don't have a family doctor, and in an era where a lot of people do not have access to a healthcare professional, they're scared and they don't know where to go. And so doing this type of mass media communication really helps. And people like to poo-poo the media, like nobody reads the newspapers, nobody watches TV anymore. At the height of COVID, I think Mitch, I hope this number is accurate. She was telling me that they were getting like 200,000 views for the nightly news at 6. Because we used to do like lunchtime and then rebroadcast at 6. There's no lunchtime news segment anymore because Bell Media has been cutting back, right? But she was like, you can reach, and this is local news. This is Montreal. Like you can reach tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people. I was talking to a reporter from CTV. He came in to guest lecture at the class that I'm teaching now for the public health students. And he was like, on a good day, if we have a good clip on a good story, it'll get like 100,000 views on YouTube. And that's City News Montreal. This is not the New York Times, right? These are local affiliates. They have reach. We sometimes underappreciate how much impact we can have. And then, of course, you go national, and it's even bigger than that. So the point of all this is, yeah, when you go national, I mean, when I'm doing the CBC News Network stuff, that's across the country. I get emails from people. Oh, Dr. Labos, I saw you in the thing. I don't know what to do. And then a lot of people are also like, who drew that? Who painted that painting behind your left shoulder? The number of questions I've gotten about that painting is shocking. I will tell you where I got it. I found it on the street. Somebody was throwing it away, and I was like, "Can I take it?" And I'm like, all right, it's a perfectly good painting. No idea where it came from. People say they think it's valuable. I have no clue. And then just because I really felt like I didn't have enough free time on my hands, I started doing a podcast with my friend Jonathan. He stepped away from the project now, but that's another venue. It kind of surprises me when people come up and be like, "Oh, I listened to your podcast." I was like, "Really? You listen to Yeah, people listen to podcasts. Yeah, they do. So if you produce the stuff out there, it is there. And so we tackle a different issue every week. We do our deep dives, we do interviews, we do a lot of stuff. It is really hard, but we have a bit of a rhythm, and I do it for what it's worth. It's not the biggest, it's not the Andrew Huberman podcast, but then again, I'm not selling supplements, right? I'm trying to provide scientific information, but we get about 10,000 downloads a month. I'm like, it's not bad. That's respectable, right? Most podcasts don't make that much. So I'm like, okay, we're doing okay. We're doing good. We're reaching people, right? It has an impact. And again, Toby helps with the podcast. The good thing about podcasting is that we think it's very, very complicated, but it's not. It's actually relatively straightforward. You just need a microphone and a computer and an internet connection to upload the file afterwards. A lot of this stuff is not as hard as we think it is. We just don't have the built-in infrastructure to make it happen. And so I'll just skip over this in the interest of time. I've experimented with other stuff over the years. The animations, these were very hard to do. These were very expensive, and it became cost ineffective to keep going. But I love this. This is one of the things that I'm most proud of, the vaccine one that I did, again, pre-COVID. So, I was anticipating the future, how vaccines work. I had a lot of fun with this, but it is just too expensive to make animations on a regular basis. It costs too much money, and I can't draw, unfortunately. I wish I could. But I started doing other videos. This is for Medscape, so for people who subscribe to Medscape, right? Medscape is free, but you have to register. We started doing videos a la like last week tonight with John Oliver, so me in front of a camera talking about a story, and a little bit unhinged and a little bit funny, because they wanted to try something a little bit more creative. A lot of the science communication we do, we think it has to be very serious and very boring and very state and very conservative, right? And I was like, can we try something a little bit different? I said, let's try it. What do we have to lose? So we started doing these videos, and they're apparently doing quite well. So a lot of this is really just trying stuff and looking to see what sticks to the wall. And so I still write articles. I wrote this article. This ended up getting me invited to a podcast in the UK with this journalist from the UK who fell for the cholesterol. There's a lot. Most people don't know that there's an anti-cholesterol pseudoscience like clique out there. There are people who are actively advocating against statins and against cholesterol treatment in general, trying to make the case that cholesterol doesn't matter for heart disease, which of course is scientifically completely untrue. And I have our lecture about how cholesterol denialism became a pseudoscience, which is a fascinating historical retrospective, because it was basically this stepwise phenomenon where the research became increasingly more definitive, but a lot of people just couldn't change their minds, and a lot of people couldn't give up the criticisms that they had like 30 years ago, because the cholesterol issue was really, really only settled in the 1990s with the introduction of statins, which is still within living memory. Like a lot of the people who are arguing against cholesterol are still alive today. And so it's very hard for a lot of people to have changed their minds. So attacking these issues from the excuse me, from the historical perspective is always a little bit interesting to me. And so this article and some talks that I gave related to it led to a podcast with this journalist in the UK. And he was like, "Are you interested in writing a book about this?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'll write another book. I've already written two, so might as well a third." I mean, the first one is just an echocardiography manual for the cardiology trainees, which is fun. It always sells about like 12 copies a year because there's only like that many trainees in the world, right? But it's fun. It's a book that I wrote and it's hard. And then I wrote this for the general public. Does coffee cause cancer? No, it doesn't. But I thought it was going to be a joke. I thought people were going to think it's satirical. People actually come up to me and ask me if coffee causes cancer because this is type of the stuff that's flowing out there on the internet. So you can buy it anywhere. I don't have any copies with me now, but I can always find you guys, like autograph it. It is, as far as I know, the only science book about food epidemiology that's written as a romantic comedy, because it is written as a romantic comedy. Like there's a narrative flow to it, so you can read it, but you're also going to learn about, multiple hypothesis testing and selection bias, and like there's examples and there's references at the end. So I was doing the Eric Topol podcast, and he was like, "I think you've created a new literary genre there," and I'm like, "Yes, I'm like Mary Shelley. I've created science fiction." But actual science fiction. It's science written as fiction, which I don't think has ever really been tried before. For people who people have read The Wealthy Barber, it's that sort of idea, but for science instead of economics, right? So this idea of having a narrative flow. The way this happened was when I pitched the book, they were like, "Yeah, okay." I wrote a standard science book, and like, "Can you make it funnier?" I said, "Well, I can make it kind of like the podcast that I do, a conversation." And they're like, "Okay." So I wrote it as a conversation, and I showed it to a friend of mine. And the first chapter I wrote was a doctor going into a coffee shop and talking to a barista about coffee. And I showed it to my friend, and she was like, "Pretty good," but I kept expecting him to ask her out at the end. And the minute she said that, I was like, boom, it's a romantic comedy. So I sent it to the editors, and they were like, most science books don't have narrative arcs to them. And I'm like, well, mine does, apparently. So yeah, that's the book. And yeah, yeah, exactly. Exactly. And so it's allowed me to go out and, the books basically self-fund the speaking tour to the public. And so it allows me to go out to communities. And I've been to places. I mean, Montreal is easy. It's like anything within driving distance of Montreal, I can go to very easily. Across the country is hard because the publishers don't cover the costs and it's expensive to stay in hotels. I had to go to Toronto for like other stuff. It's like $400 a night in hotels right now. It's getting crazy. So it's kind of hard to do, but at least in the greater Montreal area, very easy for me. That's Ken. We actually had been speaking on the radio for like 3 years and we had never met until we met at the first book signing event when he came out to do the public event. So it allows me to go out there. And the minute we throw it out to questions, like these events sometimes last like 2.5, 3 hours. I give like a 40-minute presentation and people are just asking questions. People are hungry for information. People have poo-pooed the information deficit model of science communication recently, and I think with good reason, because we're not going to fight misinformation by just educating the public. But I do think a lot of people really are just asking questions, and they want an expert to tell them what's true because they don't know what to believe anymore. It's not a question of disbelieving the experts. They don't know where the experts are because the information is not just easily accessible. So, by the way, sometimes doggos show up in the book. There's a corgi, and a corgi showed up to one of the book events. So we took this picture. We were equally surprised with each other's presence. So there we go. Um, so that's my background. That was a very long background for a talk. I really do apologize. This is like a 3 hour talk, right? I have time? No? How many? How- I sometimes when I start these things and I say thank you everybody for coming out. So over the next 4 hours, we are going to explore the very relevant issues. Okay. The question that people have, actually, my first idea when I was speaking with Kathy and Erica, and we were trying to sort of figure out what this talk is going to be about, because people are like, "What's your specialty?" I'm like, "I don't know. Everything, nothing. I don't know what I am." I said, "Hey, do you guys want to do like a media training thing? Because the communications department does it, but I also do this with the PH students, the master's students I'm teaching. I'm like, do you want me to come and like bring the gear and we'll like set up like a mini studio and we'll try to do like mock interviews and we'll practice and I'll show you guys techniques and whatever." And they were like, "It's not going to work for the 4 o'clock thing because most people are going to be online. Maybe a future one." And I was like, "Oh, okay." But I figure at least I'll give you guys the snippets, because I recognize most of you are not going to want to go out and write op-eds. Some of you might do media interviews. But let me give you the basics of what you need to know, because I'm not here to teach you about the content. There is no tricks, okay? There's certain rhetorical tricks that you can learn, but those are not important. Frankly, the things that you need to focus on are very, very basic structural presentation issues, because you're going to think this is silly, but it does matter. The things that matter most are lighting and framing and presentation and video quality. You think none of that matters, but it does. The medium is the message. And there's a reason why we say that, because this stuff does matter. And if you're going to do regular interviews, frankly, investing in a good quality camera and a good quality microphone makes the difference. If you have a phone that is less than 2 years old, you have a very powerful camera in your phone. If you have a decent computer, especially if you have a desktop, the microphone is pretty good. And even if you want to buy an external one, you can get stuff for $40, $50. So if you want to plug something into your office here, honestly, for less than $100, you can get stuff that is basically studio quality. Most of the journalists now will film their interviews on their phones. They walk around with a tripod, they plunk their phone onto the tripod, and that's what they use to record video. So you can easily do it, because all you need is a microphone and a camera. And if it's not built into your computer, because some of the older computers here won't be, all you need is your phone and an external microphone and a tripod, quite frankly. So let's go over some of the basics just so that you guys know this stuff. Because this is my setup at home. This is my TV studio. When you can, face a window. Always have two light sources facing you. The light has to be on your face, not behind you. Um, this is all it really takes, because it's based on something called the three-point light system. And if you know nothing else about staging yourself for a TV interview, do this. In the olden days, they would come to you, and journalists still may, but more and more they're going to do stuff on Zoom. They used to use Skype. Skype has been retired, which is actually a tragedy to me, because Skype was actually a better program for TV interviews for technical reasons. But now it's going to be on Zoom. You have to start thinking about a three-point lighting system. So basically an overhead backlight, which most of this is fine, even though fluorescent lights are terrible, but at least two sources of light on either side of you to give the light onto your face. That's what it is. Otherwise, you are going to be cast in shadow. And you are going to be less believable if you're cast in shadow. I know you think this is nonsense, but it's not. It actually really does matter. And it doesn't take much, right? It can be as simple as that. Desk lamps that you get at like IKEA or Walmart. These are not expensive things. You can obviously get more expensive stuff, but you don't need much more than this. Also, if you can face a window, there is nothing better than natural light. Always face a window. Never have a window behind you if you're giving a lecture. I give a whole 1 hour lecture on lighting to the PH students, and they're like impressed that there's that much to talk about, but there is. The other thing is, if you're going to use a laptop, understand something. Angling matters. The ideal angle for an interview should be slightly above your eye line downwards. The reason why they carry cameras on their shoulders is because they want to shoot you from above. And so if you have a desktop, you are basically having the perfect angle. If you are going to use a laptop or an iPad, it's going to shoot you from below, and you are going to look bad. There is a reason why people on television look beautiful. Partly it's genetics, partly it's selection bias, but a lot of it is lighting and makeup. With proper lighting, you will look better looking than you actually are. I prove that on a daily basis. So what you have to do is, if you're going to use a laptop, understand that the angling of your laptop is shooting you from below, and that is a problem. What you have to do is put your laptop on something, and honestly get a pile of books and put your laptop on that so that the camera is slightly above your eye line. That's what's key. The problem with using an iPad, and I can always tell when somebody uses an iPad for an interview, is that your temptation is to look at the center of the screen, whereas you should be looking at the camera. Now, with AI, there is some correction factor that can be put into place, but it's better to look directly into the camera. And that is the technique you have to learn. What I do is I take a little post-it, I post it right next to the camera lens, and I know to look at that yellow rectangle. Because your temptation is always to look at the screen. Don't look at the screen. Look at the camera. I can always tell when people are using iPads because their angling is off, and they always look like this when they're talking. Which is why the first thing I asked when I came in there is like, where's the camera? There's the camera. because you have to know how to look at the audience. I'm looking at you guys, but I'm also looking at the audience on Zoom. People need to see you make eye contact with them. It's important for communication. You think this stuff is silly, but it's not. The other thing too is if you're going to use a computer and you're going to use Zoom on that, you have to turn off notifications every time you do not notifications, reactions. Every time you do an auto update, it may turn these things back on. So every time you do like a thumbs up sign with your thing, it's going to generate this. Every time you move your hands in a certain way, you're going to get this. You're going to look silly. You have to realize, and this is important, you have to turn it off on every platform. So you have to turn it off on Teams, on Zoom, on Skype, on whatever else you happen to be using. FaceTime, right? You have to turn it off on FaceTime if you're using FaceTime. Otherwise, it's gonna because you think you don't realize it, and then one day you'll make a gesture like this, and the computer will think it's a heart, and it will generate this thing. So these things are there. You have to manually turn them off because the default is for them to be turned on. And sometimes they turn on automatically when you do an update. I don't really know why. And, choosing a background does matter. I mean, partly for vanity's sake, but if you can craft something that looks good, it's a more visually appealing thing. If the audio and visual quality of what you're producing is unpleasant, people are not going to listen to it. You only have for a live interview maybe 3 to 5 minutes. And for a pre-taped segment, probably even less to get your message across. So you want to make it something that people are going to want to watch and want to listen to. I know a lot of you are reluctant to engage with the media. And I get this a lot of times with friends like, are they going to make me look bad? Are they going to misquote me? Journalists are like bears. They are more afraid of you than you are of them because journalists are not like this. Journalists are like this. They are trying to do their work and they need you. They do not have the expertise to produce this story on their own. That's why they've called you. My advice to you is if you get a media request, you should always say yes. And that's my policy. You should always say yes because you will make the story better. And I realize there's a time commitment involved, and I realize it might be disruptive to your day. But the reality is, a journalist, the way most assignment reporters function is they start their day at 10 a.m. They're assigned the story. They have to get the story filed by like 3:30, because oftentimes they have to do the editing themselves because newsrooms are shrinking. They only have a few hours to get the story out. And so what they need from you is not world expertise. They need a little bit of context to put the story in a way that is understandable to the general public and for you to tell the general public what they need to know about this issue. You have one key thesis statement that you need to get out from your research or from somebody else's research. You get that out. And so when it comes to measles and vaccinations, again, you don't need to be an expert on measles virology. You just need to know what the public health guidelines are. 2 doses, booster dose if you only got one, if you're in a high risk situation. And if you were born before 1970, you're probably immune. That's it. And then, you need to know a little bit about what the general symptoms are. And you know what the general symptoms of measles are. It's in the corners of your brain somewhere from your undergrad or medical school or what is, what is it? It's the typical viral symptoms of fever, muscle aches. It's the red spots. And most people recover, but sometimes it spreads to your brain and you die. That's what it is. And we need to remind people that before the vaccinations, we used to have measles deaths in this country. You hammer home the point. Measles is not benign. Children die of it. And the correct number of measles cases in this country is 0. Every measles case, and in particular, every measles death is a tragedy because it's a preventable tragedy. When that young kid died of rabies in Ontario, you don't need to be a world expert on rabies. You just need to say, what do people need to know? If you find a dead bat in your room, unless you are 100% certain that bat did not come in contact with you, assume you were bitten and go get a rabies shot. If you get the rabies shot, you will live. If you don't get the rabies shot and you develop rabies, you will die. The case fatality rate with rabies once the symptoms begin is 100%. It is the worst disease that can affect a human being because there's basically no treatment. There is basically nothing you can do to stop rabies once the symptoms start. There have been 20 cases of people surviving rabies over the entirety of human history. And so that's like And a lot of these were like people who probably maybe didn't have rabies. It was sort of unclear, right? But like, that's the point you need to get home. Any doubt, get a rabies shot. Because if you're wrong, no harm done. But if you did get rabies, now you've just saved your life. That's the point you're trying to get across. You're trying to get across you're not writing a PhD dissertation. You're telling people what your thesis is. You're getting across the thesis statement. That's what the media is for. And so, look, it's a frustrating thing because sometimes interviews get canceled. Sometimes you get ghosted by the reporter. Sometimes like, oh, are you free tomorrow? And you're like, yeah. And they're like, oh, sorry, the assignment changed. We're not doing it. And, they do sometimes treat you a little bit disposably, right? They're a little bit sort of dismissive. And you're like, don't you understand how busy I am? I made time for you. Like, so there is a little bit of attack on the ego there. That is something that sort of does happen. Don't take it personally. You probably are not great at answering your email. So if somebody ghosts you, if somebody is not as respectful as of your time as you think they should be, understand that we live in an imperfect world with imperfect people trying to do the best that they can. Remember that we're sort of all in this together and that you help them by being involved. And so, my advice to you and my exhortation to you is get more involved when journalists ask you because they need your help. They need to get this story out and you will make the story better. And if it's not you who's there, it's going to be somebody else who maybe doesn't have the best interests of the public in mind and will say nonsense thing like, I don't think a pregnant woman should take Tylenol because there's been a link to autism. I saw that in a CBC story once. I'm like, really? Really? You're telling pregnant women they shouldn't take Tylenol because there's a link to autism? Come on. But you weren't there. Somebody else showed up, and that story has to go live, and that's what happens. So, this is just what I said before. So, we'll skip over that. Okay, I did say I am mindful that we have to leave time for questions. So, this is the point. Is like we tend to say that, oh, we're losing trust. Like people don't really trust doctors. They don't trust the media. They don't trust the government anymore. In fact, it's not true. When you actually survey people, healthcare professionals have a very high degree of trust still. You have a significant role to play in the improvement of public health because people will listen. I firmly believe that one of the reasons why we're seeing flagging vaccination rates for not just measles, but everything else is people don't have access to a family doctor anymore. If everybody had access to a family doctor and a pediatrician, they would just be like, doctor, should I get this vaccine? Yeah, you should. It would be okay. The number of people, because I'm still practicing cardiologist, right? I know it doesn't seem like it. I'm actually still a practicing cardiologist. People come up to me, they're like, doc, can I get the COVID vaccine? Because I'm on Coumadin. I'm like, yeah. They're like, okay. That's what they wanted to know. They heard something. They were a little bit concerned about blood thinners. They were like, is this okay? Yeah, like, yeah. He's like, can I take Tylenol after the vaccine? Yeah. Can I take Advil? Yeah. Do I have to worry about interaction with the metformin? No. I heard metformin can cause kidney damage. Can it? No. But if you have kidney damage, you can't take metformin. Oh, okay. That's what they want to know. They have questions. And if we were there, if we had more family doctors and pediatricians, I think we would resolve a lot of these issues. There's obviously a hardcore of anti-vaccine people out there, like the people who send me death threats, that are never going to be moved. But most people are part of that movable middle. And if we were there, if we had regular follow-ups with them, because now, if you think about it, why is it hard for people to get vaccinated? You're forcing people to wake up and consciously make an effort to log on to Click Santé, make an appointment to go get vaccinated on their own initiative. And I don't know if you've ever had to use Click Santé. It's not the most user-friendly website out there. It's not. It's better than what we had before, which was nothing. But it's not the most user-friendly website either. Like it's hard. And so if you make it hard for people to do something, they are not going to do it. And so a lot of the flagging vaccination rate is a consequence of access more than anything else. And so for people who say like, oh, people are losing trust in doctors, they're not. Maybe a little bit, right? There's certainly, it's not the 1950s anymore, but that trust is still there. We just have to show up to make it happen. So I had some examples of debunking and how to approach scientific stories. But I realize I was told to stop for 45 minutes. So I'll give you guys a choice. If you're in the room, if you're watching this on Zoom, you're out of luck. You have to show up to be counted. Shoe in elections. Do you guys want me to power through some like case studies or do you want to throw it open to questions? You answer the case study? All right. So sometimes it takes a little bit of basic epidemiology to spot the problem with the story. So this is the one I get a lot, right? Red wine is good for your heart. What's the problem here? These are very basic epi concepts. What's the problem with somebody saying red wine is good for your heart? How are you going to debunk this? This is going to happen, right? People are going to ask you this. Why is there a U-shaped association here? I have a whole 1 hour talk on red wine. So if people are interested, I come back. I have graphs. I have studies. It's fascinating. There's Mendelian randomization stuff that's been done in the UK. I interviewed the lead researcher. Fascinating stuff going on here. Red wine is not good for your heart. Trust me. I've had a patient come up to me like, Dr. Labos, I after the heart attack, I'm exercising regularly. I take him out medication. It's really good. I just find it really hard to drink 2 glasses of red wine every day because I just don't like red wine. And I'm like, oh God, stop. But why does this come up? Is this, huh? Yeah, largely yes, but it's even more basic than that. That's sort of the complicated answer, but it's even more basic. Like what's happening here? There's actually a basic, yeah, exactly, exactly. It's reverse. Basically, if I unhide the slide, oh yeah, this is the joke, right? This is what happens to me every day. These are cartoons we tried to produce. I wish we could do more of them. I loved making these cartoons. It's just too expensive and I can't draw. We don't have the money to pay artists. I wish I was a better drawer, but I'm not. What happens is you see a U-shaped association until you uncover the fact that there's a difference between never drinkers and former drinkers. People who never drank are more or less at baseline risk like everybody else. It's the former drinkers who used to drink and then quit because they developed heart disease, cancer, high blood pressure, diabetes, what have you. And they were told by their doctor, maybe you should quit drinking alcohol because there's a lot of calories in alcohol. Okay? That's all you have to explain to somebody. If you're going to debunk the red wine thing, you don't have to write a 1,200 word article like I did. I wrote that for Medscape. You don't have to give a 1 hour PowerPoint presentation. You just have to explain the fundamental concept. The reason why red wine looks protective is because the people who drink no alcohol have other stuff wrong with them. And it's the same thing with vitamin D and COVID. It's the same thing. These issues keep coming up. This is just basic epi stuff that the general public doesn't know about, but that you do because you live it every day of your lives when you're doing research and analyzing data. Okay? Here's another thing. Remember a few years back, the National Toxicology Program did a study on mice and rats, and they exposed these mice and rats to cell phone signals continuously for 2 years, and they found that there was an increased risk in cardiac schwannomas. You know, I mean, what's special about cardiac schwannomas? But they did this. There were a few interesting things about the study. This is when I learned that rats and mice are actually different animals and not the same thing, which was a fun fact to learn. But basically, what they did was they took these rats and male rats and yeah, so male and female rats and mice, and they found a signal for cancer, but only in male rats and only for cardiac schwannomas. If you don't know what a cardiac schwannoma is, I'll tell you Schwann cells are the nerve cells and nerves, so tumor of the nerve cells in the heart. Very, very specific thing. I've never seen a cardiac schwannoma in a person, by the way, but here, whatever. Okay. But not for schwannomas overall, just for cardiac schwannomas and also for malignant gliomas, but only for one type of cell phone signal. Okay. So they did this study and they investigated different types of cancers. This is basically what their data table looked like, right? They had male mice, no signal, female mice, no signal, male rats, positive signal for those two things, female rats, no signal. What's the problem? How do you debunk this to the public? Because people were losing their minds about how cell phones were causing cancer. And of course, nobody really changed their behavior because everybody still has a cell phone. But you're called on by the media. How do you debunk this? Again, basic epidemiology problem. Multiple subgroup analysis, multiple hypothesis testing. Exactly that. If you test for enough types of cancer, you will eventually find something. The fact that you only found it in one of the 30 some odd subgroups that you were testing, that's to be expected. And these are very, very basic concepts. And you might say to yourself, okay, yeah, if you set the type 1 error rate at 5%, we'll do enough tests. And, do 10 tests. Your chance of a false positive is over 40%. That's just basic math. So that's what you have to explain to people. No, your cell phone isn't going to cause cancer. You just cut up enough rats, you're going to see a weird signal for something. And you might be like, okay, well, this is like a very theoretical thing. No. How many of you who this guy is? Brian Wansink. Very big name in food epidemiology, was advisor to presidents. Have you ever heard the story that the portion sizes in the Joy of Cooking cookbook are going up, and that's why we have obesity, because portion sizes have gone up with each edition of the cookbook? That's a thing. How many of you have heard the story about the bottomless soup bowl? This idea that if you put a trick bowl in front of people, they will keep eating soup. That's him. Not true. Not true. A lot of his research was garbage. And it was exposed when people actually went back and looked at his data, and he was basically making stuff up. And There were many issues. The bottomless soup bowl thing actually probably never happened as an experiment, probably never actually happened. But his thing about putting stickers on fruit to make it more attractive to kids, But his problem is he would basically gather all this data, analyze it over and over and over again until he found something interesting and then created a narrative around it. Multiple hypothesis testing generated a lot of research that I quoted that informed US food policy for years, ended up being debunked because of basic mathematics. These are the types of things you have to be aware of. Because the problem with multiple hypothesis testing is that it leads to publication bias too, right? If we're only inclined to publish stuff that's new and interesting, you end up in a situation where antidepressants seem more effective than they are because only the positive studies get published, whereas the negative studies get submitted to the FDA and don't get published. I actually spoke with Eric Turner for an article, very nice guy, and he was telling me how he came to this. He was working at the FDA and he was like, hey, wait a second, why are all these negative studies never seeing the light of day? He published this paper in New England Journal of Medicine. I mean, antidepressants do work. I'm not Tom Cruise, but with publication bias, we get a skewed impression of how effective they actually are. And and there are issues with antidepressants. I wrote an article from Acclaimed way, way back on study 329, which some of you may not know about. But basically, pharmaceutical companies have suppressed information about the dangers of antidepressants, especially in young kids and the suicidality risk, a thing that we could fix with open data, but there's a lot of resistance to open data. So these are the issues that you have to talk about to the public, because if we can get the public to start talking about open data more, it would happen. Now the problem is there's inertia because it's not really something the public really cares about, right? But open data would make things a lot better because you wouldn't have situations like this. Anyways, obviously a much bigger, much more complicated topic. But this is what the public is seeing, right? They're seeing all these studies, red wine, cell phones bad. What do we believe? That's why they're confused. And they're confused because a very basic thing about food. Did anybody do food epidemiology? I was giving a talk once at the Jewish, and there was like a food researcher, and she came up afterwards, and man, she hated my talks. I really went to town on food questionnaires. But does anybody ever do any work with food questionnaires? Yeah, yeah, yeah. So let me show you what a food questionnaire looks like. I'm going to read this out now. I need to put my glasses on because I'm not a young man anymore, apparently. So basically, if you've never seen a food questionnaire, it's basically like doing a university exam. You get a booklet with like questions for every food, and you have to fill in the bubble, right? Is it 1 day per week, whatever, whatever, whatever. These are the instructions you get. Please try to average your seasonal use of foods over the entire year. For example, if a food such as cantaloupe is eaten 4 times a week during the approximate 3 months that it is in season, then the average use would be once per week. I am pretty certain people are not doing this for every single food in a 15-page booklet. That's impossible. We're getting guesses. Now, the guesses might be reasonable. And for big concepts, like how often do you eat at a restaurant versus eat at home? Yeah, those things are probably accurate. But do you know how many eggs you ate last week? Like, honestly, do any of you know how many eggs you ate last week? Yeah, they're a little expensive now. Ah, it's bird flu for you. But it's like, but what about baked goods? There's I ate a thing there. Was there an egg in that? I don't know. Maybe there was. That's the thing. Like we're relying on guesses, and so a lot of food research is based on an inaccurate measurement. Do we have an inaccurate measure? Now, to be fair, I can't come up with a better solution. Like, is there a better solution for this? No. I mean, when you do make a food kitchen, like that's tough for research. Like, you're gonna have a research kitchen, that's expensive. And unless you're going to do research in prison, which people have talked about with regards to salt, which was a really bad idea because we're not Nazis, you can't really experiment on prisoners easily. Like that's hard. There are ethical considerations there, so it's really hard to do food research. So we have to be able to look at it with the appropriate degree of skepticism, because we know what's true in food research. We know that overall processed foods are bad. We need to get rid of trans fats, which we did, right? We need to get rid of salt out of food, which we are in the process of doing. So we know what has to happen. We just can't get too lost in the weeds. And so part of what you have to do is be like, look, don't get too excited about a story about strawberries and heart disease. We don't really have the granularity in the data to be that specific about stuff. We know what works in terms of general concepts. Chocolate. Does chocolate boost your brain performance? This is a study, New England Journal of Medicine. I thought this was a joke. Okay. Does chocolate boost your brain performance? What's the problem with this study? This was New England Journal of Medicine. Chocolate consumption versus Nobel Prizes. Published. Lot of news headlines over this. What's the problem here? Yeah, they're probably richer countries that have do more research funding. I mean, it's the U.S., Switzerland, whatever. Okay, but even more general, what's the issue with saying that countries that eat a lot of chocolate are countries that win Nobel prizes? Chocolate's not the same in every country. Fair point, but even more basic. Very possible. Very possible. Very, but even more fundamental. Even more fundamental. Countries do not win Nobel prizes, and countries do not eat chocolate. People win Nobel prizes, and people eat chocolate. And with this research, you haven't established that the people who won the Nobel prizes were the people who were eating the chocolate. And there's a name for this. It's called the ecological fallacy. And we've seen this before. Remember how, like a decade or so ago, they were talking about how women who eat saturated fat are an increased risk for breast cancer? That was a thing. It's not true. But why they were doing that? Well, they did a graph very similar to this. They said, well, look at the countries where there's high rates of breast cancer. These are the countries where there's a lot of saturated fat consumption. Yeah. But you haven't established that the women who are eating saturated fat are the women who are getting breast cancer. You're just showing an association between two things. This is just a random association. Yeah, and there's if you really want to get historical, I think there's a very famous book about called Le Suicide about suicide rates in Prussia and looking at Catholic versus Protestant countries and tried to make the case that suicide rates were higher in Protestant counties as opposed to Catholic countries in Prussia, and is one of the first examples of the ecological fallacy being manifested. So these issues keep coming up. Once you know about them, once you can spot them, you can debunk it. Because when somebody comes to you and be like, "You're a food researcher. What do you think? Does chocolate boost your appearance?" You're like, "No." And then for good measure, you can throw out the fact that there actually was a study on this. It was called the Cosmos study. It was supposed to be the randomized control trial funded by Mars, by the way, the chocolate industry, that was supposed to settle once and for all whether chocolate actually had either cardiovascular or neurocognitive benefits. Published negative, didn't make a difference. People still keep talking about chocolate being good for you and having protective benefits. And this wasn't even a study about chocolate. This was a cocoa bean extract in pill form. And it still didn't make a difference because chocolate is obviously not a cocoa bean extract because there's a lot of fat and sugar because cocoa is actually unpalatable. They're like cranberries. Nobody voluntarily eats cocoa. It tastes terrible. They only make it palatable because they're coating it in fat and sugar and selling it to you in a chocolate bar. So these are the things you have to know. Again, this is not hard. These are 30 seconds of reading up to date or Wikipedia. You can get this stuff, but you have to know it because that's the spin you have to give to the media, to the public. You got to give them the information in a very clear and digestible way. Side note, don't give chocolate to dogs. Very, very poisonous. And so, confounding again, vitamin D and COVID, like I said. Remember how people lost their minds about vitamin D and they were like, we got to treat the vitamin D, it's COVID. I'm like, no, like, oh, these African Americans in the US are at higher risk of COVID complications. Like, no, they're at higher risk of COVID complications because of lower socioeconomic status and a privatized healthcare system that inherently discriminates against ethnic minorities. Vitamin can do a lot of things. It doesn't fix racism, right? There are reasons why these things happen. And so you have to be there to inform people like, no, this is obviously not true. We know why this is not true. It's confounding. It's the same story we saw with HRT. It's the same story we see time and time and time and time again. You just have to be there because some people meant well and were like, I need to find a solution to this problem. And they said, well, maybe it's vitamin D. No, because the problem with it, these are not benign. Because if you entertain the possibility that maybe it's vitamin D, then what happens? Well, it's not a far leap from that to ivermectin, right? And then you have Lethal Weapon, Mel Gibson here talking about ivermectin, which became the thing, and Joe Rogan talked about it too. Why? You can debunk this very easily. All the studies about ivermectin have been retracted. They were due to fraud. But again, you have to be following the literature to know this sort of thing. But this is not hard. This takes about 30 seconds of research. You don't have to get into the weeds with the general public. Be like, you believe in ivermectin? By the way, that study you keep quoting was actually retracted because of data fraud, because the researchers mixed up the Excel files. The explanations that a lot of these researchers gave when they explained, like, oh, sorry, we got the wrong Excel files. Really? Then how did you duplicate your data 4 times in a copy paste thing? Like the errors people make are absurd. You think being a data detective is hard. It's not. Most bad researchers, like most criminals, are actually kind of stupid. And they make elementary mistakes. It's just that we don't often go and fact check the stuff that people are producing. And again, these are not like honest errors. Like these are people who are committing, outright fraud. I mean, we've studied ivermectin and metformin and fluvoxamine as COVID-19 treatments. Frankly, nothing has really panned out. Fluvoxamine a bit, but really it didn't really seem to make much of a difference. But ivermectin clearly no. And with Aaron Rodgers and the COVID-19 vaccine, yeah, remember the COVID-19 vaccines were supposed to cause infertility? I had friends who call me up. It's like, Chris, young women, is it safe for me to? I want to have kids someday. Can I get it? Where did this come from? Do people know? Because this is how you debunk it. When somebody comes to you and says, I mean, they're not going to do it now as much anymore. Somebody comes to you and says, COVID-19 vaccine is going to cause infertility. What do you need to know? What do you need to say to them? You have to know the history. You have to know where it came from. Does anybody know? Anyways, two guys write a letter to the European Medicines Agency, Wolfgang Woldard and Michael Yeadon. This is a letter they wrote. They're like, Dear European Medicine Agency, which is the European equivalent of the FDA, I'm very worried about this COVID-19 vaccine because the spike protein that the COVID-19 vaccines are targeting is very similar to syncytin-1, which is a protein on the placenta. What if the antibodies that you're generating with the COVID-19 vaccine start attacking the placenta and lead to miscarriages and infertility? And the answer is, well, no, actually, syncytin-1 and the spike protein are actually not all that similar. And second of all, you dum-dums, if antibodies against the spike protein make people infertile, you would become infertile if you caught COVID. Because if you get sick with COVID, you're going to make antibodies against the spike protein. And of course, it's not true. People kept having babies during the pandemic, anyways. So once you explain this to people, they're like, oh, yeah, you're right. Right? This is a very easy thing to understand, but somebody has to explain it to you. And it's a 10-second explanation. That's the message you have to get across. And, do COVID-19 vaccines alter your DNA? No. Tell me why. Any basic science researchers here? Why would an mRNA vaccine not change your DNA? Very, very basic explanation for the general public. Everybody in this room should be able to answer this question. Why does an mRNA vaccine not affect your DNA? Yes, there's no reverse transcriptase. How does mRNA get back into the nucleus? It doesn't, right? mRNA is not going to get into the nucleus. It's only going to embed yourself in your DNA if you have reverse transcriptase, which it obviously doesn't. You can explain this stuff to people very, very easily because you don't have to be like, well, I need to look and read the papers. Like, that's not what the public wants, and that's not what the journalists want. They want a very, very clear explanation. mRNA does not go backwards into the nucleus unless you have reverse transcriptase. COVID is not HIV. It's different. It's not a reverse transcriptase. That's all you have to say. Those are the words. You don't have to be a virology expert or a genetics expert. So, initial controversy. And oh yeah, this was a study that came out of the University of Ottawa. I feel bad for them. They made a case that the rate of myocarditis post-vaccine was like 10 times higher than been previously reported. You know what the problem was? They miscounted the number of doses that had been given. The denominator was wrong. They said in all of Ottawa there had been 32,000 doses of the COVID-19 vaccine. So basically, I don't know if I know the numbers are cut off, but basically it's like, and then they posted this to a preprint server and they were like, you realize we've given out more than 32,000 doses of the COVID-19 vaccine in the whole Ottawa area, right? And they were like, oh, sorry, we meant 320,000. And people were like, oh, sorry, it was an honest mistake. I'm like, okay, honest mistake, fair. I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. You had 7 co-authors on that paper. 7 people read that manuscript and not one of them like clued in. And look, this is what happens, right? There's a manuscript bouncing around. People have read it. You don't reread it. Okay. But these are the mistakes. This is what you have to debunk. This is how you have to explain to me. We're like, no, you disregard the study. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt. It was an honest mistake. The problem was they miscounted the number of doses. That's the explanation. That's the debunk. That's what you communicate to the media. You don't get into this whole rabbit hole about myocarditis. We're like, look, it's very, very low. We know what the numbers are. This study is not something you should be worried about. Disregard it. It was a mistake. Mistakes happen. We'll give them the benefit of the doubt. But either way, you don't need to be perfect. You just need to show up. And that's the take home message here. If we are going to engage with the media, we have to engage. We don't have to be perfect. We don't have to give detailed dissertation level explanations. We have to give them the basics because that's what they want. They want the context to be able to better understand what is actually happening in the world. And this is my teddy bear. Thank you very much. Yeah, well, it's tougher. But interestingly, with RFK,
Debunking it in RFK world.
for all his anti-vaccine talk, what happened? Measles cases started going up. Most people don't know this. He had to write an op-ed where he was like, it was something like vaccines are going to save us. Vaccines are the way in which he actually had to write that. So there's two ways to look at that. One is that this is all just disingenuous and they're all opportunists. But the reality is, as much as these people want to sort of like feed into this narrative, it is unsustainable. If measles comes back, if polio comes back, people are going to see what the complications are. The point is not for us to be right, right? If we're, it's the point is not for us to prove that we're right. For us to prove that we are right, children have to be paralyzed because then people will realize it. We're trying to prevent that from happening. And so this is why we have to be there so that when things start to drift, we can course correct quickly. Because as I don't, the big debate with all these people, whether it's Trump or RFK or Andrew Wakefield, is like, how much do they actually believe what they're saying? And I don't know. I genuinely don't know. How much of it is opportunism and how much of it becomes delusion that you just sort of like believe because you repeat it ultimate times, or how much of it is them just not caring. But at a certain point, the facts become impossible for them to ignore. And that's what we're seeing with measles. When you have a massive measles outbreak in Texas, even somebody like RFK has to change course. He may not like it. And he may sort of like grit his teeth and try to throw in a few caveats there, like he did. And he's like, well, vitamin A also helps, which again, he's like relying on a few things. Like, yes, it's true. If you have vitamin A deficiency, measles can be worse. Nobody's really vitamin A deficient in the US because we supplement our food with it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's what you have to be there for, to be like, yeah, 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 nobody's vitamin A deficient. That's not the issue. The issue is vaccines fall, cases go up. That's the point. Even RFK in writing has now claimed that that's the case. That's what we're there for, to basically keep people accountable, to keep the people in power accountable to this issue, because that's what we have to do. We have to keep fighting this fight every day because there will always be, maybe there won't always be measles. Maybe we'll manage to eradicate it like we did with smallpox, but the reason we eradicated smallpox, not because it magically went away, because there was this sustained public health effort by the WHO to eradicate it. We could eradicate polio. We just need the money to make it happen and the political will to do so. We can do these things, but it's not push a button and it happens. It's a sustained years long effort. And you do that by keeping the public pressure up there because politicians will invariably do whatever gets them elected. And if there is a public willingness to see something happen, they will make it happen. And that's what we're there for, to sort of inform the public about why this is important. The public doesn't care about open data, but they should. The public doesn't care about polio, but they should. We have to explain to them why it's important by also occasionally debunking some of the nonsense that pops up there. And so the reason why I do what I do, not every week, not every story I do is a life-changing importance, but you have to be there ready for when the important stuff does happen, like the measles outbreaks, like COVID, like Mpox, like all the stuff that have happened, because you need to be there for the emergencies and you have to be around for the routine stuff.
Thanks, Chris. Was wonderful. I have a question. So we're talking about trying to debunk false news.
Yeah.
But we're all humans and sometimes we make mistakes and
Yeah.
sometimes we realize later that something we said was incorrect. So
Yeah.
have you been in that situation before? And
Yeah,
what
I
did
mean, here's
you?
the thing. Nobody's going to blame you for making mistakes, and you can always correct yourself. Well, so during COVID, the science evolved,
Mhm.
right? At the beginning, I was saying stuff. At the right beginning of COVID, they were like, should people wear masks? I was like, no, we don't walk around. This was unthinkable. Like, Ben, at the beginning of COVID, did you think that we would be walking around wearing masks? Like, no, you don't walk around a hospital wearing masks. That's crazy. That's crazy. You wear an N95 if somebody has tuberculosis or measles. That's it, right? There's no such thing as airborne spread. Oh, we eventually learned it. It took us much longer than it should have. And I mean, I still wear a mask regularly. I don't as much anymore, I have to admit, because I got ground down by opinion. But I got a lot of grief for that. I got a lot of grief for the mask thing. But it's necessary. Like when I'm seeing patients, I still wear a mask. When I'm on a plane, I still wear a mask. I'm just breathing the same air as all you people. You guys are the number of people who get sick coming back from vacation astounds me. So I still do it. And it's because of airborne spread. And I think, we had to change and we didn't change quickly enough. Frankly, if we knew at the beginning of COVID what we know now and we had told everybody go out and buy a HEPA filter, I think we would have had a very different outcome. But we didn't know and we didn't learn fast enough. And that's partly on me. I mean, I wasn't doing basic, the aerosol research. We didn't appreciate it as quickly as we should. And I don't think we realized how important it was going to be to talk about indoor air quality. But it was. And now we're going to have a very long, very complicated, very expensive process of upgrading our infrastructure. There's a lot of schools and a lot of old age homes in this province that are very old, do not have windows that open, and do not have central ventilation systems. And that's a problem. We're going to have to fix that. And it's going to be expensive, but there's no other solution. And so we're going to have to build new infrastructure to make it happen. And there isn't the same political will now as there was in 2020 when people were frankly scared for their own lives. But that's what we have to do. I try to bring up indoor air quality as often as I can because you need people to remember that this is an issue. In the same way that we need air conditioning in long term care facilities. Otherwise, seniors die during a heat wave. We need air conditioning. And the fact that the buildings are old and sometimes can't support it is a problem. We need new buildings, but that costs money and we're in a deficit in the government, So these are the issues that we have to talk about. And we don't often have the answers, but we can keep needling and pushing.
I'm wondering if you have been contacted by a journalist that already had an agenda. Like, for example, a while ago, I was contacted by a journalist in the US from the Atlantic. And just by the email that I received and the questions that she had, because I do research in rehabilitation, and in this case was about long COVID. And
Yeah.
it seems that long COVID, like this word is the word is divided. Exercise or
Yeah.
rehabilitation is bad for long COVID or it's good for long COVID.
Yeah.
There's nothing. So she was on the side that it's bad for long COVID. So I was hesitant, but then I said, if I don't talk to her, I will not be telling my story or my, my reasons for doing this research. But it didn't go really well. She was not very pleasant to talk to.
So here's the analogy that I give people. Imagine if you were set up on a blind date and it went poorly. And as a result of that, you decided that you were going to die alone and not go on any dates anymore. Bad dates happen. Bad interviews happen. Not everybody is good at their job. And sometimes, reporters are human beings. They have their own biases and all that. Your job is not to write the story. They're journalists. Your job is to give them the information. They may choose to disregard it. It happens. Don't let one bad experience turn you away from what is an important public service. Because, I mean, again, I don't read every single paper about long COVID that comes up, but I had to become a COVID expert by accident. I think there is controversy. Like, nobody really knows what to do with long COVID, right? Like, we refer patients to long COVID. I see a lot of long COVID patients because they all have cardiac complications, right? Like, I send them to the long COVID clinics. They would come back and they're like, they don't have anything to offer me. I'm like, nobody had anything. We have no treatments. We have no treatments. We've spent $1 billion studying a condition for which we have no treatments. And maybe it's untreatable, right? Maybe it's complicated. Maybe it's not one thing. Maybe it's a bunch of different things. Maybe it's a bunch of different problems that we sort of lumped under one umbrella, which is why it's so impossible to characterize and define. I think you explained that. And I think if you have the conflicting voices in the story, you highlight to the journalists and to the reading public how complicated the issue is, because sometimes there is no answer. And sometimes you need to show that there is a lack of agreement in the scientific community, specifically because we are uncertain, probably because I firmly believe long COVID is not one thing. And that's the message you get across. You're like, look, some studies have shown it helps. Some studies have shown it doesn't. It kind of depends. I don't know. I think you try and you see and you hope and you take some comfort from the fact that most people do tend to get better over time, but they get better over the course of years, not weeks. And I think that's the expectation problem that a lot of people have. That's the message. And so that's the thing. It's like you had one bad experience. I know it sucks. It happens. You do it again. Next time will be better, presumably. But it's tough. That's the reason why people don't do it. They're like, why should I do it? I wasted my time. It was unpleasant. I got stressed out and I gained nothing from it. I was once told years ago, Chris, maybe you should stop doing these interview things. They're not really helping your career. People told me that. And they were like, don't do it. It's not like it's not helping you. Like, why are you doing this? It's like, I think it's important. And I think the events have sort of borne out that it is, because if we don't talk to the public, they are going to believe that ivermectin cures COVID and inject themselves with ivermectin. There was a group of people, I will tell you, that were going up to I won't say any names. They were going up to a place up north where these people kept animals. And so they were ordering ivermectin from a vet and they were injecting people to protect them from COVID. And that was a thing that was circulating. People were going and driving up north to inject themselves with ivermectin. You know, that's not great. That's not safe. That's not good for public health. You need to push back against that sort of stuff because the stakes are real. People get sick, people die. And when you have a measles epidemic, it's even more important. Yeah.
I think I've asked you this before, but does this count as your service or how do you
I do
go about
this
it?
because it brings me intellectual joy.
Uh-huh.
Nobody, I shouldn't say that. I believe there will be an announcement in a week's time about something, but I get no academic credit for this. None whatsoever. I do it because it brings me intellectual joy. I don't make any money off of it. I mean, I sell the book, so I guess that's something, but you don't become rich by writing a book, let me tell you. You get rich by selling supplements on your podcast. That's how you make money. You don't become rich. I do this because it's fun. I mean, I am teaching the class in public health now with Maru Karpai. So I guess that has become sort of my academic thing as well. But no, and that's the problem. And I think we need a structural change in science communication. Like people come up to me like, I want to do science communication, but there's no fellowship in science communication. Yeah, you can maybe kind of the research chair in like knowledge translation, but it's still very green. We don't have a pathway to it. Whereas if you want to become a respirologist, you know how you become a respirologist. You go, you do a respiratory, you do a rest fellowship in the US, you come back, you're a respirologist. I know how to become a cardiologist. I know how to become this, right? There's pathways. You go, you do PhD, you do a postdoc, you do this, and you get appointed. Science communication is still so new. Like we don't have an endowed chair in science communication. We don't talk about it in a scientific way because I think we're all still kind of figuring it out. So why do I do it? I do it for fun. Maybe I'll be a trailblazer. Maybe generations from now, people will write the history of science communication at McGill and they will say Chris Labos was the first endowed chair in science communication at McGill University. Probably not. But that's the type of thing is like we have to start thinking about it as a necessary academic discipline because the truth is it wasn't that important 20 years ago. It's so important now because the internet and social media have made the internet basically a quagmire of horrible. And we need to respond, otherwise, things are going to get worse. So it is a new specialty that does not exist. So we need to make it exist. And I don't quite know how we're going to do that. My hope is that we figure it out over the next 30 years, that by the time I'm prepared to retire, there is some pathway because I have new students come up to me like, how do I help? And I'm like, okay, well, maybe help me on the podcast. I don't know. Like, but they're not getting academic credit for it. It's not a job. I don't have funding for it. I need to find a way to make this institutional. And I don't know yet. Maybe it's about applying to grants and making it that way. I don't know. But there's no, like, this can't be my lab, but maybe it should. Like, when you have a lab where you're not actually producing research, but just communicating other people's research, like, that's still a little bit far out there for people to really understand, but maybe it is. Maybe that's the pathway. I don't know. I kind of have to figure it out on my own because no one's done this before. So if anybody has any bright ideas, let me know because I'm trying to figure it out like the rest of you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Labos. That's been very engaging and entertaining and thought-provoking.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.